Again, the electron transport chain is connected to the citric acid cycle because it processes the NADH and FADH2 from the citric acid cycle into NAD plus and FAD that can be used again, and it uses the energy harvested to produce ATP. The electron transport chain only works if there is oxygen to ultimately receive the electrons from NADH and FADH2, and the citric acid cycle only works if the electron transport chain returns NAD plus and FAD to it. The combination of the electron transport chain and the citric acid cycle, where carbons get oxidized to carbon dioxide and oxygen gets reduced to water, is essentially combustion, except broken down into little pieces so that we can get ATP from it instead of, fire. If you look closely at the diagram, you'll notice a few things. The first is that NADH and FADH2 enter the electron transport chain at different complexes, but both make the same CoQH2 cofactor. Also notice that the complexes 1, 3, and 4 pump H plus into the inner membrane space. You can see the H plus with the blue arrows coming through. That eventually gives us the energy to make ATP. These are the major highlights to look for in the next slides, in which we look at complexes that process electrons from each cofactor and how much H plus they reduce. The electron transport chain works because NADH and FADH2 electrons are relatively high in energy. These electrons could be used to reduce oxygen to water directly, but by making small transitions in energy at many complexes, we're able to harvest more useful energy as a gradient of protons, that is H+, and ultimately ATP. Notice again that NADH uses complex 1 to send electrons to CoQH2, while FADH2, which is lower in energy, uses complex 2 instead of complex 1 to send electrons to CoQH2. Again, the electrons are always moving from higher energy to lower energy until ultimately they combine with oxygen to make water. We need oxygen for the electron transport chain and therefore the citric acid cycle. The first complex, complex 1, oxidizes NADH to NAD+. That can be used in the citric acid cycle again. There are many redox reactions that happen within complex 1, beginning with electrons being transferred onto a flavin, like in FAD, and then to an iron-sulfur protein, and then to a coenzyme Q, abbreviated CoQ, which becomes CoQH2. In the process of this series of redox exchanges, complex 1 will pump 4 protons for every NADH. Remember that these 4 protons are only produced for NADH, since FADH2 does not send any electrons through complex 1. So again, highlights, complex 1 is responsible for oxidizing NADH, and it pumps 4 protons. Complex 2 only processes FADH2. It never does anything with NADH. Since FADH2 starts out as a flavin, it never sends its electrons to another flavin, like what happens to NADH electrons in complex 1. But it does send electrons through an iron-sulfur protein and eventually to CoQ to reduce it to CoQH2. Because this is a smaller drop in electron energy, complex 2 is not able to pump any protons into the inner membrane space. So now we've looked at complex 1, which takes NADH electrons and puts them onto CoQH2, and complex 2 that takes FADH2 electrons and puts them onto CoQH2. So we have the same redox cofactor for both complexes, they just reduce different pieces. NADH in complex 1, FADH2 in complex 2. Notice that complex 1 and 2 are never both active. It's always one or the other to make the CoQH2 that will bring electrons to complex 3. Because complex 1 pumps 4 protons and complex 2 pumps none, NADH will have higher ATP yields than FADH2. At complex 3, we have another cascade of reductions, bringing electrons from CoQH2 and restoring CoQ by moving those electrons eventually to 2 cytochrome C molecules. Cytochrome C is a heme-based protein that handles electrons by converting iron at the center of a heme from +3 charge to +2 charge. Since each reduction only handles a single electron, 2 cytochrome Cs are produced for every CoQH2. This complex is able to pump 4 protons for each co-QH2 that reacts. Complex 4 takes the 2 cytochrome Cs that come from complex 3 and then oxidizes them. With electrons it gains, it reduces oxygen to water and pumps 2 more protons into the inner membrane space. This is the end of the electron transport chain, but again, it only works if the electrons have someplace to go at the very end. We cannot use the electron transport chain without oxygen. For a summary of what happens in the electron transport chain, follow the arrows from either NADH or FADH2 through each complex in the top figure. NADH engages complexes 1, 3, and 4, while FADH2 engages complexes 2, 3, and 4. By looking at which complexes pump protons, we see that NADH is able to pump 4 protons at complex 1, 4 protons at complex 3, and 2 at complex 4, for a total of 10 protons. Similarly, FADH2 is only able to pump 4 protons at complex 3 and 2 protons at complex 4, for a total of 6 protons pumped per FADH2. So again, NADH2 is responsible for pumping 10 protons with its electrons, and FADH2 is responsible for pumping only 6. In the ATP synthase complex, all the hydrogens that are present in the inner membrane space can pass back through like water through a watermill. The energy of the hydrogens passing back is used to physically pound a phosphate onto ADP and produce ATP. This overall reaction gives a yield of 1 ATP for every 4 protons. Since we know how many protons per NADH or FADH2 and how many ATPs per proton, we can determine how many ATPs an NADH or FADH2 are worth. NADH pumps 10 protons, and since 1 ATP is produced per 4 protons, 10 divided by 4 gives a yield of 2.5 ATP per NADH. Similarly, FADH2 pumps 6 protons. 6 divided by 4 gives a yield of 1.5 ATP per FADH2. Notice on this slide that these conversions have been taken one step further. If NADH is worth 2.5 ATP, the citric acid cycle produces 3 times 2.5 ATP from the 3 NADHs for a total of 7.5 ATP. The citric acid cycle also produces 1.5 ATP from the single FADH2 that's produced, and a GTP is also produced in the citric acid cycle that has about the same level of energy as an ATP. The citric acid cycle and the electron transport chain together then produce a total of 10 ATP for every acetyl-CoA. So again, acetyl-CoA is worth 10 ATP, NADH is worth 2.5 ATP, and FADH2 is worth 1.5 ATP. ATP is produced from the catabolism of every major biomolecule in catabolic processes, but it is also the fuel we use to power all sorts of work, from powering anabolic pathways to allowing our muscles to contract. So again, we want to keep a good track of how much ATP some of our most important molecules are worth, because they give us a good way to track how much energy they are worth overall. In case you missed it before, acetyl-CoA is worth 10 ATP, NADH is worth 2.5 ATP, and FADH2 is worth 1.5 ATP. Most of the oxygen we breathe in is used in the electron transport chain, but the rest becomes reactive oxygen species. We use these reactive oxygen species in our white blood cells to destroy whatever they're attacking, or in our peroxisomes to metabolize molecules that don't have dedicated pathways for degradation, for example drugs, which we talked about with the grapefruit effect. We only want these in really dedicated places because reactive oxygen species can also do all sorts of damage to our own bodies, which is why it's important to avoid exposure to reactive oxygen species. Common avoidable sources are things like UV light, industrial pollutants, and smoking. Don't smoke.